We're the All People's Health Collective, where organizers, advocates, and everyday people come together to demand care, housing, and freedom for all. APHC is fighting for care without control, housing without conditions, and dignity for every person.
Good morning, Russell.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing okay. I'm been a bit of a whirlwind lately. I've been traveling, so feeling good to be back at home. So yeah, doing
Yeah,
well.
thanks for doing the All People's Health Collective podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah. So I'm Katie. I'm one of the members of the All People's Health Collective, and I wanted to ask you if you want to introduce yourself to folks.
Great. I'm
How would you
Russell.
introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm Russell Dawson Rawlings. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a white male, middle-aged, reflecting on the fact that I am now 49. So I don't know, uh, I'm starting to guess enter this older adult journey at some point. I am.
I feel that.
Today, I'm wearing a green polo shirt. I have brown hair, mustache. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses, and behind me is um, a background of a pile of rocks. I think that today I was reflecting that I really want to be grounded today, so that was my aesthetic choice there. I am the Communications and Strategic Partnerships Manager at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers as my day job and professional life. I'm
Hmm.
also a person with cerebral palsy. I have CP and have lived with a significant disability for all of my life, um, and have really navigated the world as a disabled person kind of in two phases. One, kind of my childhood in Texas with my parents and family. And then I did something a little bit radical and uprooted myself and brought myself to California in 2001 and learned life all over again with literally one person as a connection to California, and then
Wow.
ultimately kind of connecting myself with the independent living movement and resources. And it was quite the full-time job for the better part of almost 2 decades, right? So yeah, it was quite an experience, and I learned an awful lot about myself,
Hmm.
including um, kind of some of the work that was as I was learning about myself, I was also learning my place in this giant complex place we call the world. Particularly, I think the thing that really opened my eyes is I had to, kind of accept. I knew and accepted my disability. I did not know and did not connect with life as someone who honestly was living life as a poor person, someone who
Hmm.
was extremely economically disadvantaged and was actually building community, along the way with other folks who also were experiencing extreme poverty and continue to experience extreme poverty. So, a lot of the early experiences I had um, with kind of community organizing and learning about the disability movement were in spaces with people like myself. And
Yeah.
a much more diverse group of folks uh, than myself as well.
Got it. Awesome. So if some of our listeners don't know what independent living centers are, how would you describe them or talk a little
Yeah,
about those and maybe a
yeah,
little bit
yeah,
about their history?
absolutely. I will say, first of all, just straight away, that Google is the worst way to try to figure this stuff out a lot of times, unfortunately. Um,
Yeah, definitely.
unfortunately, we're in it's a reality where, I'm saddened every time I type in independent living, I get bombarded with, actual physical places that tend to be older adults, right? That are marketed toward, a living place, right? And it's basically an apartment with some additional amenities for older adults. That is not what we're talking about here. The independent
Yeah.
living movement is a rich kind of uh, uh, the independent living movement really started with disabled people who were aging and finding themselves in situations kind of much like my own, where they were growing up in a world where able-bodied people were setting the kind of conditions of society, and there just were not opportunities for folks with significant disabilities to live in the community that they were choosing to live. A lot, like vast majority of people with any kind of significant disability were automatically relegated to these spaces like skilled nursing facilities and institutional settings, whether or not they really needed them, and more importantly, those spaces were not, you know, geared toward the promotion of anyone living a whole life. Really, they were a very institutional setting, much like you see other institutional settings, which we can certainly get into because I think that's important. The history of disabled people, largely also included uh, attempts to institutionalize those that refuse to be institutionalized, such
Mm-hmm.
as like the ugly laws that we saw, for so long in this country, where people with disabilities were literally being, locked up. And I think that practice ended sometime in the 70s, actually, which is shocking. Which ironically is also the time that uh, people with disabilities started organizing and demanding more, and that really the identified location where that really took off. And again, there have been I'm skipping over a lot of history because there are other organized efforts by disabled people, but the one that I'm referring to, the independent living movement, really took root in Berkeley in the early 70s, and kind of that the same energy that was carrying forth the Civil Rights Act. There was a group of disabled folks in Berkeley that were demanding access to UC Berkeley. And from
Mm-hmm.
that experience, they organized within their community there at the school and ultimately envisioned an idea that shouldn't, independent living shouldn't have to, start with, let's go to university. It should be available in the community because one, it wasn't going to be a complete process if you
Mm-hmm.
had to, kind of go through that arduous front door, and also folks even graduating were finding themselves not able to navigate even after obtaining degrees.
Awesome. What would you say where would you say the independent living movement is today?
Ooh, well, first of all, it's international, which is amazing and great,
Amazing, yeah.
right? Like so the leaders within that space were very intentional. Actually, they didn't see any. They saw as the conversation grew that it needed to grow rapidly and globally, right? That it should not be limited to any kind of one place. That the idea was that people with disabilities live everywhere, and that we are the most diverse group of people on the planet. I mean, I think one of the quotes that I always lean on is that of Ed Roberts that says, our movement, our community is open. We people are free to join at any time, right? And most people, if they live long enough, probably will join the disability community at some point. And so, where is it now? I think we're at a place where, um, again, I think the kind of idea of independent living in this country is such that there's a well-founded network, or not a a rich network of independent living centers available in quite a number of communities. It's an interesting story because I think that between 1974 and I'd say the early 2000s, independent living centers were growing, and again, every community was kind of working toward having some process of developing an independent living center. Now that it looks different, of course, for rural communities, but interesting fact. The past year or two have actually seen that number shrink slightly. A lot of
Really?
that due to, a lot of that due to funding difficulties. Independent living centers are funded at, and I'm going to give a ballpark figure because I think this is what I've heard is correct, approximately $128 million a year from the federal government. Now that's $128 million a year for the entire country.
Well, it's a
That's,
lot.
so there's
Yeah.
kind of, I think what we've seen is we've kind of hit like a hard kind of a ceiling, right, on the funding that's able to support independent living centers. So I worry that, the idea that we can continue to expand and grow into newer communities or more communities and have a more impact is actually kind of stalled, because that funding has set flat for quite some time.
Got it. Got it. Going back a bit, who was Ed Roberts, if our folks don't know?
Yeah. So Ed Roberts was one of those leaders that was in Berkeley. Again, kind of known. Ed Roberts was known as someone who was a leader in this space. He had developed polio, kind of a little bit, late. I think late childhood, but early enough that it impacted his school journey. So he was someone who kind of had to navigate a life where, he was shut out from educational opportunities, and his mother actually really became, an early advocate, and they both of them really leaned into their ability to challenge the system. One of my favorite quotes is that I guess when informed that he was going to to live to that the post polio kind of conditions weren't imminently terminal. He was someone who did rely on use of an iron lung, so his disabling conditions were pretty severe. However, through the use of the iron lung, he was able to live, a relatively, supported life. And anyway, the doctors had claimed that, that he was going to survive this condition with this support. And his mother was, quite visibly relieved. And the doctors informed, said, well, why are you so happy? He's going to live the rest of his life as a vegetable. And apparently Ed Roberts heard this story either directly or indirectly, and decided that it was okay to live life as a vegetable. He was going to be, if he had to, he was going to be an artichoke, prickly on the outside, but with a big heart. And I think that story, was one that he would carry to rooms whenever he was kind of introducing this concept. He had a really well-developed, actually, spiel about, the importance of living independently and being given opportunities, for disabled people to live independently within the community. Anyway, those are some of the early stories that were developed. And I think the real thing that I've seen, when I watch, there's a 2020, or not 2020, 60 Minutes interview with Ed Roberts, and And honestly, I admire that every time that he was focused, the media chose to do something like this. He just honestly just opened his life up. He said, this is just who I am. Showed him with his son, riding together on his wheelchair. He was someone who famously was not shy about his use of cannabis. He lived a real life, right? And so I
Yeah.
think in many ways that was one thing that I think is uniquely his. So I think it's part of the reason that a lot of folks latched on to this idea that he was a figure that was critical to the movement. I'll also say that kind of in parallel, and that's why I want to be careful to kind of fixate just on Berkeley.
Yeah.
It's so important that we think about the greater context of disability organizing and kind of that, what led to where we are. That in parallel, there was something happening on the East Coast as well. Judy Heumann and her journey, and in not only did she navigate again getting her degree in New York City, which is notoriously not a very physically friendly place to people with significant disabilities, and she also was a polio survivor. So she managed to navigate all of the getting her degree, being able to she was set on being an educator, and that's where the barriers started coming in. Is that she could not get the institutions of education to accept her. She wasn't able to obtain her licenseship because they could not envision bringing someone with significant disabilities into the education space. And so anyway, there was a lot of overlap between the work of Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts. In fact, they founded the World Institute on Disability together. So again, that kind of initial idea that this should be a global movement started, again with that, very early on, the enthusiasm and just efforts of disabled people to push every boundary. I think was so critical and helped shape a lot of what we see now. And unfortunately, both of these leaders now, Judy went on to do such amazing, amazing work and passed away just a couple of years ago. But, Ed Roberts, almost a decade earlier, I believe, like kind of early 2000s. So.
Got it. Yeah. And then Alice Wong last year.
Alice Wong last year, right? So I think that it's really cool to see kind of this idea that and Alice was really great about this, about how disability movement is like a continuum. It is there are kind of this idea that first of all, Alice really leaned into the idea of kind of crip, or reclaiming the word cripple or crip, wisdom and ancestors and oracles.
Right.
And so I think
I love that.
that was really cool that I think she introduced us to the modern concept of oracle. To be honest, I don't know of any other movement that really does that to that level, but I love it, right? Like, and I've read so many great things, like the idea of like this kind of a crypt, ancestorship and wisdom, and people passing down, for example, adapted clothing or other items that we as disabled people use or find ourselves using. And I want to point out too, something interesting is that so far, really honestly, up to this point, I've talked about people with kind of significant visible disabilities, and there is a concurrent and growing inclusion of people with invisible disabilities, and I think while maybe 30 40 years ago the movement was kind of distinct. Those movements were distinct, and folks with invisible disabilities were not maybe necessarily actively included. I think we're in a space now where we're seeing, the acknowledgement that all disabilities are part of this one very rich and large community that we all belong to. And in fact, many of us have invisible disabilities, and some people that if you asked them, they'd say, "Oh, my disability is very visible. Why aren't But maybe not apparent immediately to some folks, right? So
Yeah. That was kind of leads into my next question which is like how do you like how do you experience like the state of disability organizing today? Like where would you say we are, both
yeah,
positive, negative?
I mean, I think it's complex, right? Like we have
Yeah.
all like there are now again, organizations we never probably or that our ancestors that our ancestors never could have dreamed of. Hopefully, we are their wildest dreams in many ways. But so there's both. I think a concurrent, at least in this country, especially, kind of twofold story, right? There's the very kind of well funded or not well funded, well established. I'll use well established kind of and starting to celebrate 50 years of existence. The the formal independent living movement and independent living centers. Again,
Hmm.
many of these organizations are celebrating close to 40 to 50 years of existence. Um, they are literally places where people can go with no barrier, right? Any person who identifies as having a disability can go to an independent living center and ideally, walk in one and meet community, which is really critical. So the peer support, which is part of the kind of core services of independent living, um, is available, right? So it's community. It's also assistance with navigating benefits and kind of that navigation of the world. Um, so there's that side, right? Which I think is kind of almost. I mean, to be honest, it's becoming or has become professionalized, right? It's service organization oriented, and we're ideally again this move that opportunity also trains people in advocacy, right? Hopefully gives folks the opportunity to become future advocates. With that, though, I think comes an acknowledgement that, again, with very minimal funding, these organizations were expected to kind of make something out of nothing. And in many cases,
Yeah.
particularly housing, which I would say is far and away the most requested service. And I would wager almost probably any independent living center, most certainly the ones here in California, where housing is such an extremely scarce or unavailable source,
Yeah.
particularly to folks who are, I'm going to say, poor people, but also most people are probably, the statistic says, most people are a paycheck away if they're lucky enough to, fortunate enough to have a paycheck. So
Yep.
it's it's I think there's that reality, right? And then there's again there's these folks that have independently, like Alice and others have decided a different path, right? Like that the most important work is the culture work. And so I'm excited by both, right? I'm excited by the fact that there are people now that are speaking loudly, particularly on this more interconnected and global world that we find ourselves in, social media and others. Um, and also, the fact that we have this kind of concrete base where you can find community if you're looking for it.
Yeah. Amazing. I know when we talked before, you talked about the poverty trap.
Yeah,
that a lot of disabled people experience. I was wondering if you could talk about like how that works, like what creates the poverty trap if folks
yeah,
aren't familiar
yeah.
or don't know.
Well, the poverty trap is created by, right, our benefit system.
Yeah.
The and I always it's so funny that it's like benefits, like so for many disabled people, they're born into this system of Social Security, SSI, or Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, right? So meaning that either they never had the opportunity to connect with work and are kind of brought into this social, kind of support, which we'll get into this in a minute, but it's a
Okay.
a monthly payment, right? That
Yeah.
you're insured that you can have, and that's to support people who are low income, who have never worked, right? The SSI, and then SSDI, which is a slightly more elevated payment for folks based on their contribution previously, right? So people who paid into the Social Security system and received enough uh, earned. Oh gosh, I used to know this. It's IRWE and earned. Yeah, I am failing at remembering this acronym right now, but essentially it paid into the Social Security system enough to have credits that they are then able to qualify for SSDI. So it's again a slightly elevated payment. Both of it's really critical to acknowledge that both of these payments, neither of them approach the level of what would be considered even baseline poverty in California or elsewhere, really. Um, and yeah, so the idea is that by being given this small allotment of money by qualifying as disabled, that disabled people will magically have the ability to live independently, and it is just not. Those metrics and standards were set back in the 70s, which
Mhm.
it's really critical to understand that it's fascinating to me that at the time that it was instituted, the idea was that it would be enough money for a person with a disability to live independently.
Right.
So we're think about that, right? Like hold that idea in your head that this was like in the 70s, that this concept of SSI and SSDI were being rolled out. Also, keep in mind that the independent living movement was really starting to get its footing, right? So what was happening at that moment is that people with disabilities, the disability community was actually winning a future, right?
Was actually what?
Winning a future, right? A
Yeah.
future that didn't include a path directly into institutionalization.
Yeah.
And what is not told is that win was immediately like almost like as if you can imagine like tapping into a well that's like exploding with like energy and wealth, and then immediately being capped off, right? Saying, okay, we got to throttle this as tightly as we can. And that's kind of what I think happened, right? A lot of those poverty metrics and measures were frozen in time at that point and have been like very begrudgingly budged. Like we're talking about single percentage numbers over the course of decades, right?
Hmm.
If you were to take like actual inflation and
Yeah.
certainly for people who worked a career, like their wages probably 50, 60, 70, 80% higher than that time period. But unfortunately, those metrics, the things that measure where those benefits were designed to hit, moved up maybe 5, 10%. And I'm throwing out that not these are these. If someone wants to check my math, they can. But I'm making generalized statements, but it's based in reality. One of the hardest things I think is is in California, if you choose to, as a disabled person, if you enter into what's called a share of cost situation with Medi-Cal. Most
Okay.
people don't even know about the share of cost program because it is
No.
horrible. It, it literally says that you can buy into Medi-Cal. Any person is free to do that. That you are then required to reimburse the cost of the of the support that you receive through Medi-Cal at a rate that was set again back in those early kind of 70s. The amount of share of cost, I believe, is just north of 200. It's sub $300 a month. So
Okay.
if you are in that share of cost situation, you're essentially voluntarily spinning yourself down to $300 a month to live on,
Wow.
which nobody really does. I mean,
Right.
it is a that is a completely untenable like situation.
Right. You can't even
So
get
it's
food
almost
on
like
that.
if you took SSI and SSDI, I mean, even those appear extremely generous compared to to living on $300 a month, which it's just completely backwards, right? So a lot of people again, are kind of told, to or counseled and even supported, right, by the structures that exist to live, life within that box of maintaining eligibility for Medi-Cal, so meaning not having assets over $2,000. Um, you know, Fortunately, there are some expanded tools now, like ABLE accounts, but again, all these things kind of are very counterintuitive to the idea of independence, right? They're actually enforcing more dependence on this kind of state benefits system, and ultimately, leave people kind of trapped in that poverty box. So it's very deep. Um, and like with any story, I like to tell the story. That's the stories for the people who are inside the benefits box. There are many who are not inside that benefits box. People who are unhoused, people who have never actually been formally brought into the benefit. That kind of social security system box. Um, and I think that's a critical story worth telling too, because it does require, for people who undergo the process. A lot of times, there's this really arduous process of proving that you meet the governmental definition of disability and
Yeah.
that you're qualified for benefits. And then once you're there, it's like, well, now you've chosen this. It is a forever. Even though we're going to talk about all these things that you could potentially navigate, to uh, have other opportunities, such as California Working Disabled Program here in California, which lets you have up to 250% of federal poverty level, which again, old metric, and
Yeah.
250% sounds okay, but let's be real, that barely brings you up to like what most people would consider baseline California poverty. And even then, so then you're only, contributing about maybe $200 a month toward your eligibility of Medi-Cal, which, yeah, it's maddening, really. I mean, I think that this world of maintaining eligibility for benefits is every bit as complex and difficult, and maybe far more so. One of my favorite quotes is, "It's very expensive being poor," and uh,
Yeah.
I think there's just so much truth to it. But yeah, and it plays into this larger narrative that we don't, as Americans, prioritize the health and social welfare of others.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, so I guess I'm curious to hear what do you think might be some ways out of kind of the poverty trap, or like what are some, they don't have to be policies you'd like to see, but like what do you see as kind of the road out of this and toward um
Well,
a better future for disabled people?
yeah. I mean, if we could think back, right? Like if we could look backward to that time, and
Solve all these problems in 10 minutes.
right,
No, I'm
right,
kidding.
right, right. I mean, if I could, I mean, I am just old enough to not have witnessed, like, I mean, so again, and this is the problem, right? Is that uh, disability is both a huge community and it's an isolated kind of like it's something that we're not given. Like, there's no roadmap like that people are
Yeah.
given as disabled people, right? They're not told, oh, you should go check out an independent living center. And in fact, I mean, different people have different interactions with, I'm going to be honest, different people engage with independent living centers in different ways. And they're not, they're imperfect just like the rest of everything around us, right? They're only as good as we can, envision them being. But um, I think if we could recapture kind of that same spirit that led us to envisioning and developing these things, right? Saying that, that it is okay to say that we're going to guarantee folks a a life, right? An ability to navigate the world and change, give everyone an equal playing field. Honestly, living our value of equity, right?
Hmm.
Making sure that everyone has that chance, right? Um, it's kind of the counter narrative to pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? It's the give everybody some bootstraps to begin with, so they don't have to go like figure out what a bootstrap is and how to build it. It's like that is an impossible task, right?
Right.
Uh, the better task is to say, okay, here's what a bootstrap is. We are giving this to you, and here's how you here's how you use it. Here's how let folks have that baseline. This is you know, again, more quotes, right? Like we're only as rich as we treat the poorest members of our society, right? So
Yeah.
um, that concept, right? That we want to raise, gosh, I can just keep feeling like I'm full of these things today, but like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Like we need to make sure that we're not trying to operate in an ocean bed without any water, right? Like that we're just pushing boats around in the sand. Um, because that's where we have, I think, landed at this moment in time. And the more that we take away funding or cap it off, is the futures that we want to see aren't possible. We're not able to, people aren't able to afford a home, for example. People aren't able to envision a life outside of a very narrow context. So I think that, you asked what can we do to change it. I think we open it up, right? Like we look at, okay, so, SSI, SSDI, these are concepts of kind of like what we call universal basic income, right?
Yeah.
Saying that if you've proven that you're disabled, you get this allotment of money every month. And you don't have to, worry that it's not coming, it's coming. That said, the way that is, those are not universal because they are not universally available.
Right.
And moreover, when you accept that, path, then you're locked into all these other restrictions. I think unlocking the restrictions and making it such that we are saying everyone gets this basic, level of, support, right? And it can come in different ways too. I mean, universal like uh, healthcare, access to healthcare,
Hmm.
the right to housing. Those are things I think that could also really, really, really move the needle because they right now they're barriers, right? So they're where people fall through. They're They're, when you see people on the street, you can be guaranteed that each one of them there's a story behind
Yeah, absolutely. So universal right to housing, universal healthcare, universal basic income.
Yeah, and I mean,
I like it.
this sounds really like, and the counter to it, right, is how in the world will we afford all this? Well, again, the math is real simple. We have extreme wealth held by a very small number of folks,
Yeah.
and it's just about shifting the balance, right? Shifting the levers, and I think honestly any amount of shifting helps improve outcomes, right? So, I think we can start doing the work of shifting the levers the other direction and seeing what's possible. Because honestly, I mean, again, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the work of folks that did that heavy work,
Hmm.
literally a generation ahead of me, really.
This might be, this is of interest to me because I study health systems, so this might be a very specific question.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the tension and the fear among um some disabled folks that um like single payer healthcare systems can be a death trap, or the rise of MAID in Canada. So I guess I'm curious how you create a universal healthcare system that doesn't then devalue the lives of disabled people and how it treats disabled or ration care to disabled people.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I mean, we're talking about policy decisions and politics, right? Like, we're talking about decisions that are made whether or not we're talking about single payer, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're talking about, like, because let's be real,
It's not like our current
the
system
one
values
of the
disabled life
things.
either.
Uh, Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I said it's not like our current system values disabled life either.
Precisely. Actually, I was going to point to the fact that here in California, actually, over the past 2 years, actually, some new policies have been passed opening up the door to further access for folks to access, medical assistance in dying. And we're one of sadly, I feel like, it's interesting that I'm on I'm speaking to you from a part of the country that tends to envision itself as progressive, and the West Coast in general just kind of has this politic, or identity as being progressive, right? Um, and that means also in conversations that are difficult, like this one, right? Like the medical assistance in dying. We literally removed, a lot of the kind of the safety guards that we had placed on it last. It was 2 years ago. Yeah. So a bill was passed that opened this up, and I don't know that a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that disability um, is these concepts are rooted in the idea that there have always been attempts to erase disability through medical means, right? The medical model even is
Yeah.
one of the models through which people view disability. We in the independent living movement tend to see disability through a social model, social lens, right? That it's the society is disabling us, not so much the medical um, definition of disability, right? Or medical model. But this idea that that the healthcare systems are really already doing this, and moreover, if it was universal, the decisions could be made to simply not do that. Like that is a choice, and again, we're already seeing it in our system. One of my good friends and colleagues, Dan Oakenfuss, we actually just had this conversation about, you know, dwarfism and how the medical system, is now, advancing in ways that drugs and such are available to support, people who have been diagnosed with various types of dwarfism. And if those drugs are used as an intervention early on, could technically reverse the condition, right? And is this then you go down the rabbit hole of by doing that, are you then erasing that person's identity and their opportunity to live as an experienced life as disabled and as part of a culture of little people or people with dwarfism, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, these things are already happening, is what I'm getting at, is that, our medical system is already, medical systems, even as patchwork and bizarre to navigate, and again, that's a stress that I think every American, if they live long enough, is going to, I'd argue that even just the trauma of navigating medical systems is enough to make one disabled. Going through that in my own family as my parents' age.
Yeah. On that point, I think you mentioned before about so for example, like, I think, forgive me if I'm misrepresenting what you said before, but I think you're talking about some of the like how poverty itself can be disabling, right? And kind of the other direction of the poverty trap, and I think you're talking about, for example, like groups that, like the disabled community hasn't necessarily always included like folks who use substances or what have you. Like, so I'm curious on your thoughts about that.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, the definition of disability was set a long time ago. It was set fairly broad, but it definitely discriminates against folks who have, used substances, and it called that out. It was actually a compromise, right, that was made. It was one of those big compromises that was made back when all of these, things were being talked about, the Americans with Disabilities Act, just like similarly, the idea that the ADA is enforceable only by individuals, right? So some very big compromises were made when these big structures and things, things that we like to pride ourselves that it's the best, civil rights legislation for people with disabilities worldwide, right? And that may be true, but it's also narrow, right? Because we have definitely repeated the past in that we have decided who's in and who's out. And,
Mhm.
Substance use, people who are disabled through substance use are unfortunately left out in many contexts. Now, again, some states do more, California being one of them, but not all, many states do not. And, since it's not formally covered under the ADA, support can look almost non-existent.
Got it.
So it's almost like you're still living the life of a disabled person. You're just not allowed into that. So that means SSI and SSDI are unavailable to you.
Right. I think I want to
Until
say
until
there.
and it's fascinating actually, because I think in a lot of those
Yeah.
cases, if one can prove like that there is a different disabling condition that occurs as a result of that substance use, that then can be a qualifying, thing, right?
Right.
So it's again this very almost, it's disgusting, a concept that like if one is disabled enough, then you become eligible, right?
Yeah. You mentioned, I think you were talking about the importance of kind of like an intersectional perspective on disability. Forgive me if I misrepresented again what you said. Feel free to correct me. I'm curious if you want to talk a little more about that, about kind of intersectional organizing.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think we can't do any disability community work without acknowledging its intersections, and it's difficult. I always say this. I'm what people think of whenever they look in the book for definition of disability, right? I'm a person with cerebral palsy. I'm pretty physically disabled. I look pretty gimpy and crip. And uh, but I am not the only disabled person. All disabled people do not look like me. In fact, jokingly, like I was at Abilities Expo over the last weekend, and some
Oh,
folks
cool.
came up to me and were assuming and guessing disability, and I don't necessarily look like someone with cerebral palsy for people who are familiar with people with cerebral palsy, right? Um, and and so the reality is this is the deepest type of intersectional work. People with disabilities are literally from every background, culturally. Yeah, it's a deep intersection. So really, the best thing we can do is acknowledge those intersections and acknowledge again, like we were talking about with substance abuse, the people who are outside that and the value of saying, no, you are a part of our community and welcome in this space, and we need to be sure that we're pushing the boundaries. I'd say that right now, another area that we're seeing challenged immensely is support for undocumented folks and folks that are, kind of left, marginalized by the concept of even citizenship
Yeah.
and other things. So, again, California being a bit more progressive in some areas has expanded access in certain ways, but those expansions are also the very first to be stripped away immediately, like we're seeing it now with the state budget, right? Those are the first areas that they're like, oh well, remember when we spent that extra money on, on ensuring this population has access? Well, we can't afford that anymore, so we're taking it away, and so that's I don't, you know, I can't imagine that life myself, but to wake up and know that one political decision away from losing all of their access is disheartening.
That's a really good point, particularly in like designing a universal basic income system and
Mm-hmm.
including undocumented people in it.
Right, right. I mean, that we've got to, it's going to be building and envisioning things. It's got to be critical that we have these tough conversations, right,
Yeah.
about inclusivity and deep intersectional organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to share that we haven't gotten to?
Well, I mean, I'm just really excited that these conversations are happening. I mean, I think we need to, we all know that organizing happens on the ground, but it's great to, to be able to hear the stories of folks, the work of, All People's Health Collective, will hopefully inspire folks to find ways to connect and organize. I just, I'm really excited about getting the root of the issue here, which is poverty. Um, whether or not one
Yeah.
identifies as being disabled, hopefully we can acknowledge that poverty is disabling people, right? So that's the thing that I think if we're talking, I'm not, again, I think we did talk a bit about medical eradication of disability or people with disabilities being, cured, treated, other, I'd argue that we need to have that same intensity on our society, right? Like we need to be more intense actually with and more intentional about how do we make it such that being disabled is not a in and of itself a condition of poverty or being trapped in a box. How do we undisable disability broadly, right? Like
Yeah.
how do we make that a thing? Some other cultures, especially ancient ones, didn't have this same analysis of disability that we do. In some, again, looking back to Alice, some people in some cultures, people with disabilities were seen as oracles or magical. and to be respected and revered and seen as having a deeper insight into the world.
Amazing. I want the future you're describing.
I do too. I do too. Yeah, and I'm not, again, I'm just reiterating all the stuff that I've kind of absorbed, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a historian. I'm not I would never consider myself like, nearly as great. I think, the most powerful thing, actually, Alice's greatest contribution, I believe, is the fact that she opened up the ability for folks to tell their stories in powerful ways and to have that, hold that power, right? NPR's StoryCorps, and, the Disability Visibility Project, all of those things are the things that will really shift this conversation. And again, if we tie it to, a narrative that we demand that poverty not be the end of the road for folks, the ultimate disabling condition.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. This
It's
was
been great
fun.
to talk with you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this.